Racist woman thought the dogs would scare Big Shaq's mom back into silence. But what followed turned the entire neighborhood upside down. Big Shaq's mom didn't flinch, and Big Shaq didn't back down. From unleashed hate to unstoppable truth, one scream cracked suburbia wide open, and the next move, that rewrote everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The day it happened. I wasn't home. I wasn't even in the same city. I was sitting in a bright, glossy studio, halfway through filming a commercial for a sneaker drop, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail that would make my whole world lean sideways. It was from my mama, Lucille. Her voice was cracking, breathless, as if her words were limping out of her chest instead of rolling off her tongue. She didn't say much, just my name once, soft, followed by something that sounded like dogs barking, and then a scream that tore straight through my ribs and hit something buried deep. Florida heat doesn't play fair. It presses on your skin like judgment, heavy and personal. My mom's house sat on the corner of a quiet neighborhood. Quiet, in that eerie way that doesn't mean peaceful, just subdued. Suburbia, with fences painted white, not for beauty but for boundaries. Folks smiled with their teeth, not with their eyes. And in that place, in that midday stillness, a scream like hers didn't belong. It didn't echo. It cracked the silence open. I played the voicemail 4 times before I could even process what I was hearing. Then I stood up, mumbled something to the director, and walked out without looking back. I didn't care about the cameras or contracts. My mother was in pain. That was all I needed to know. When I pulled up to her house 3 hours later, she was sitting on the porch, rocking gently in that wooden chair she always said calmed her nerves. But her hands were gripping the armrests like she was holding herself down, like if she let go she'd fly straight into the sky and never come back. She didn't say a word when I walked up. She just looked at me. And that look, God, that look wasn't fear. It was betrayal. Like the world had turned on her and she was still trying to figure out why. I crouched beside her. I asked her what happened. She just shook her head, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Ask your neighbor." That's when I saw the fence. The corner post was crooked, bent in like it had been hit. A long trail of disturbed mulch and broken flower stems stretched along the property line, ending in a spot where her carefully planted roses had been torn from the ground. That's also where I noticed the scratch marks. Not claw marks, drag marks. Like someone had been pulled or had fallen and scraped across the dirt. I turned toward the Whitmore house. Now Darla Whitmore wasn't new. She'd been living next door for 2 years. Ever since her husband Charles, a lawyer with slick hair and a smile full of teeth, transferred down from North Carolina. They hosted barbecues every other weekend, handed out Christmas cookies that tasted like bleach, and always made sure their dogs were visible during neighborhood walks. 2 enormous German shepherds, Brutus and Lady. They never barked at Darla. They did bark at anyone who looked like me, or my mother.
I knocked on their door. No answer. But I saw the blinds shift. Someone was watching. I didn't knock again. There was no point. Whatever had happened, they were already lawyering up.
Back inside, I found my mom still sitting, still silent, her knuckles white. I sat beside her, tried to coax her into telling me more. Slowly, in broken fragments, she told me everything. That morning she'd gone to the edge of the lawn to trim back a few of the rose bushes that had crossed into the neighbor's space. She always did that. She was proud of her garden, careful to keep everything neat and respectful. Darla saw her and came storming out, accusing her of trespassing. According to Mom, Darla said something like, "Stay on your side of the line." That line, my mom said, felt heavier than any fence ever could. The next part she couldn't say out loud. She just gestured toward her legs, mud-caked, bruised, scraped. The dogs had come at her fast. Brutus lunged first, barking loud enough to shake the air. Lady followed, ears back, low growl. They didn't bite, but they circled, lunged, growled, snapped. One caught her skirt, tore a piece off. She fell, rolled to her side, hands up. Darla watched the whole time, arms crossed. She never called them back, until the damage was done. And when she did, it was with a smirk. That was the part that broke something inside me. Not the fear, not the dogs, the smirk. I didn't call the police that night. Not because I didn't want justice, but because I knew what would happen. They'd show up, ask a few questions, see no visible wounds, and write it off as a misunderstanding. Maybe even suggest Mom had wandered too far, provoked the dogs. She wasn't bleeding. No bones were broken. but she was cracked in ways they wouldn't see. So I started asking around. Quietly. Subtly. The neighborhood was full of the same kind of silence my mom was wrapped in. Neighbors saw something, but nobody wanted to say it. One man, Mr. Hargrove, a retired teacher, told me, "It's best not to stir things up. These types of issues tend to snowball." I smiled politely, even though I wanted to scream. I got a copy of the HOA rules. That's when I started seeing the pattern. Over the last year alone, my mom had been cited 3 times for overgrown hedges, unapproved lawn furniture, and improper trash bin placement. All minor things, all exaggerated. Meanwhile, Darla's dogs barked at kids and tore up another neighbor's sprinkler system, but somehow she had 0 citations. That's when I knew this wasn't about dogs. This was about control, about fear, about a woman who saw my mother, a black woman, in her 70s, tending to her roses, and decided that even that was too much power for her to have. Still, I wanted proof. Not just my mom's word, not just her scraped legs or torn skirt. I needed something that couldn't be ignored. Something that would burn through silence like wildfire. So I asked around for doorbell footage. Not many people were willing to help, but one person, Denise, a quiet woman who lived 2 doors down, slipped a USB into my mailbox one morning. No note, no explanation, just a USB with the label, Monday 11 a.m., dog incident. What I saw on that footage turned my stomach inside out. Darla was pacing on her porch, arms folded, eyes on my mother like she was an intruder, not a neighbor. The dogs were tugging at their leashes. Then she leaned down, unclipped them, and whispered something I couldn't hear but could read on her lips. "Go get her." The way she watched it wasn't concern, it was pleasure. And my mother? She stumbled back, tried to use the rake she was holding to create space. She didn't hit the dogs, just shielded herself. When she fell, the dogs closed in, barking, growling, inches from her face. And Darla? She didn't call them off until almost 30 seconds had passed. That footage burned itself into my brain. I watched it 5 times, not because I didn't believe it, but because I couldn't believe someone could be that cruel, that calm, that calculating. The next day, I walked back to my mother's house, sat on that same porch. She was there too, staring out at nothing. "Mom," I said, "I have it." She turned slowly. "Have what?" "Proof." Her lips trembled. She didn't ask to see it. She just said, "Then do what you need to do, baby." And that's when I knew. This wasn't just about making things right. This was about all the women like my mother, black, kind, gentle, who've spent decades building lives in places where they're still treated like shadows. This was about a scream that tore through suburbia not because it was loud but because it was real. This was the beginning. The wound that opened everything. I've seen my mother go through storms. I've watched her bury her baby brother and raise 3 of us on a cashier's wage after Dad walked out. I've seen her shoulder death, debt, and disappointment without letting a single tear show in public. But the silence she wore after the incident with Darla wasn't strength. It wasn't pride. It was absence. Like something inside her had folded up and slipped away. I stayed the night at her house after watching that doorbell footage. Not because I thought she needed protection, but because I needed to be near her. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't say much at all. We sat on the couch together, the local news humming low in the background. Neither of us really watching. She held a teacup the way people do when they're cold on the inside. Her knuckles never loosened around the porcelain. She didn't just held it like the warmth might climb up her fingers and thaw whatever part of her had gone numb. I tried to talk, to ask more questions. "Do you remember exactly what she said before the dogs came? Did she touch you? Do you feel safe here?" But each time my mother would respond with a simple shake of the head or a one-word answer. The way someone does when they're not dodging the truth. They're protecting it. And for the first time in my life, I realized that trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it retreats into the quiet, hides behind drawn blinds, and the soft hum of a ticking clock. The next morning, I walked outside and looked around. Sunlight filtered through the palm trees, birds chirped politely from the power lines, and the neighborhood looked exactly like the brochures promised. Clean, safe, friendly. But behind that shine was a rot I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I hadn't wanted to. 3 houses down, a man I'd known in passing, Jeffrey Caldwell, was watering his lawn. I nodded toward him, trying to give him an opening. His eyes darted toward me, then away. He adjusted the hose, turned his back, Across the street, two joggers passed, both white, both tight-lipped as they glanced at me and my mother's porch. One of them slowed slightly, like she might stop, say something, but her friend whispered something too low to hear, and she sped up. They saw it. Maybe not the whole thing, but enough. The dogs, the scream, the aftermath. You don't live in a neighborhood like this without knowing your neighbor's drama within 12 hours of it happening. But no one was coming forward. And the reason wasn't ignorance, it was self-preservation. I called the HOA that afternoon, just to test the water. The woman who answered, Nancy or Linda, or something like that, put on her brightest fake hospitality voice, and said, "We are deeply sorry for any unpleasantness your family experienced. Unfortunately, since no formal complaint was filed at the time, and there's no record of medical injury, there's nothing actionable we can do. We do encourage neighborly resolution." Neighborly resolution. What does that even mean when one of your neighbors is letting dogs corner your mama, like she's prey? I hung up without another word. I was starting to see the system for what it was. Smiling faces with iron rules. Fences made of courtesy so polished they reflect your outrage back at you like you're the problem. And I understood then why Mom had chosen silence. She didn't believe anything would come of her words. Not here. Not in a place like this, where respectability politics dress up cruelty in pressed slacks and Sunday brunch. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and the footage pulled up again on my laptop. I watched Darla's expression frame by frame. The disdain, the entitlement, the glee. I wondered how many times she'd done things like this and gotten away with it. How many small aggressions had piled up over the years like invisible bruises on every black resident in that community. How many accidental comments. How many HOA letters. How many doors that stayed closed when help was needed. And then I made a decision. I wasn't going to be polite. I wasn't going to be quiet. My mother's silence might have protected her heart, but I knew the only way to protect others was to speak. Loud, clear, unapologetic. But before I went public, I needed to feel out how deep the silence really ran. So I paid a visit to the community center the next morning. Not officially, just dropped in. They were hosting a welcome spring breakfast. Free coffee and muffins for residents. Hosted by the HOA board. The room smelled like cinnamon and control. I walked in, nodding casually, wearing a sweatshirt and jeans. I wasn't trying to make a scene. I just wanted to see who'd look me in the eye. Darla wasn't there. Of course not. But Charles was. Standing near the coffee table, charming two elderly women with his story about some Supreme Court case he'd nearly argued. I stepped closer. He glanced up, didn't flinch, just smiled that politician's smile and said, "Shaquille, glad to see you out and about. Hope your mother's doing okay after that incident." I tilted my head. That incident? He nodded slowly, carefully. Terribly unfortunate misunderstanding. Darla was really shaken. We'd hoped this could all be handled, neighbor to neighbor, quiet. There it was, the game.
"You saying it didn't happen?" I asked, my voice low.
Charles sipped his coffee.
I'm saying it's complicated, and our community thrives on harmony.
Surely you wouldn't want to disrupt that over a regrettable moment. That phrase, it stuck in my throat like poison. I have video, I said, and my platform reaches 20 million people. He didn't blink, just gave a half smile. You may want to consider what kind of message that sends. Escalation isn't always the best path. I left without another word, because that was all I needed to hear. This wasn't about a woman with a couple of aggressive dogs and a bad temper. This was about a system, one that looked polished on the outside, but was rotting underneath. One that had quietly learned how to suffocate people like my mother, without ever laying a hand on them. And now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. That evening, I sat with Lucille again. She was still quiet, but something in her posture had shifted. Less collapse, more curiosity. I told her what Charles said. She shook her head. They'll never admit it. They don't have to. We're not meant to be believed. Her voice was thin, but steady. I looked at her for a long moment. I'm not doing this for belief, I said. I'm doing it for proof. She didn't reply, but this time, when I reached for her hand, she let me hold it. Later that night, I pulled out my phone, drafted a post, included a still from the video, one frame where the dogs are mid-lunge, and Darla is watching, arms crossed, lips curled in what could only be described as smug satisfaction. I didn't name names yet, just posted the image with the caption, This happened to my mother in her own front yard. This is what quiet racism looks like in suburban America. Within an hour, it had 200,000 shares. But I knew that wasn't the win. The real fight hadn't even started. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch and looked out across the street, and I saw it, curtains shifting, doors cracking just enough for eyes to peek through. They were watching now. The neighborhood had woken up. But it wasn't support I saw in their stares. It was calculation. They were figuring out whose side to be on. Not based on truth, but based on consequence. And in that moment, I realized something simple but devastating. In places like this, silence isn't just fear. It's currency. It's how the powerful stay comfortable. And it's how people like my mother get erased without ever being touched. But this time, the silence wouldn't win. Not if I had anything to say about it. I still believed, back then, that maybe, just maybe, reason could cut through rot. That if I approached it like a man, calmly, collected, standing tall but not towering, they'd see past my size, my skin, my name, and hear me. That if I knocked with the right tone, and carried enough patience, I might find common ground with people whose fears were loud, but private, quiet, but sharp. But it didn't take long to understand that in this place, apologies don't live, they don't grow, they die in the soil, choked out by pride and privilege. The morning after the post went viral, I took a deep breath and made my way next door. Not because I expected a warm welcome, but because part of me wanted to see it in her face. Darla Whitmore, the woman who let her dogs loose and stood still while my mother crumbled under the weight of their bark. I wanted to see if guilt had caught up to her, if shame had finally crept into her eyes the way it should have. I knocked once. Not hard. Just enough to be heard. The door opened 2 inches. A gold chain kept it from swinging wider. Darla stood behind it, that same smug calm on her face. Her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf. Lipstick perfect. She didn't look surprised to see me. "Shaquille," she said, as if we were catching up at a charity auction. "You really should have called." I told her I was here to talk, to give her the opportunity to say something, to make this right before it spiraled further. She looked me dead in the eyes, then said, "You people love drama." The chain stayed locked. I didn't respond. I let the silence carry the weight of what she'd said, then walked away. Because anything I said would be twisted. And Darla wasn't interested in the truth. She was interested in control. By the time I stepped back onto my mother's porch, I knew what I had to do next. It was no longer about confrontation. It was about confirmation. I needed to prove that this wasn't just a personal grudge, that what happened to Lucille was part of a pattern far older and more deliberate than anyone wanted to admit. I started with the HOA. I requested public records. At first they stalled, said I wasn't authorized. But after a few legal nudges and a quiet call from a friend of mine in state housing, the files started trickling in. Letters, fines, incident reports. What I found wasn't just frustrating. It was strategic. In the last 5 years, 87% of all HOA violations in the neighborhood had been issued to Black or Hispanic homeowners, despite them making up less than 20% of the community. Citations for things like grass length beyond regulation, unapproved exterior paint, or excessive noise from backyard gatherings. The kind of things white residents weren't written up for even once, though their properties told a different story. I found 3 families who'd sold their homes after receiving back-to-back violations, unable to fight the mounting fines and legal threats. One of them, the Harrisons, had tried to renovate their porch. They were fined for using non-standard materials, even though 3 other white families had used the same wood, same paint. The difference? The Harrisons had a Black Lives Matter sign on their front lawn. This wasn't just a neighborhood with a few bad apples. This was a system fine-tuned to squeeze people out quietly. No slurs, no crosses burned, just paperwork, meetings, smiles stretched too wide. And at the center of it, guess who sat on the HOA board's enforcement committee for 4 straight years? Darla Whitmore. I knew I couldn't fight this alone, so I started reaching out, quietly, carefully. Not everyone was ready to talk, but one name kept coming up. Tucker Delaney, a former resident, Black, lived 3 doors down from the Whitmores before they moved in. Moved out 2 years ago, practically overnight. I found him living in Miami now, running a small barber shop. When I called, he answered with suspicion. But when I told him who I was, and what had happened to my mom, he sighed long and deep like he'd been waiting for someone to call for years. He invited me down. We met at his shop after hours. He poured himself a drink, didn't offer one to me, just sat in the chair like the years still weighed on him. They do it soft, he said. Not like the old days. Back then you knew where the danger was. Now it comes wrapped in courtesy. Tucker told me how his trash bins were cited 5 times for being unsightly. How his teenage son was accused of lurking every time he walked to the corner store. How Darla once told him during an HOA meeting that some styles of home decor just don't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic, when he put up African art in his window. I stayed as long as I could, he said, but that house stopped feeling like home. It started feeling like surveillance. He handed me a folder before I left. Notes. Copies of complaints. Emails from the HOA. I could see the paper trail forming, connecting dots they thought would stay buried. But they underestimated one thing. Black folks have memories like rivers. We remember everything. And this time we had receipts. Back in the neighborhood, I took a different approach. I started knocking on doors, not as Shaquille O'Neal the celebrity, but as the son of a woman who'd been humiliated in her own front yard. Some slammed doors, others smiled politely, and claimed ignorance, but just a few, hesitated, and from that hesitation came whispers. Mrs. Laney across the street admitted she saw something odd that day. Mr. Patel, one of the very few non-white families on the block, told me he'd received 3 noise complaints in 1 month, and never once had a party. One woman, Sharon, slipped me a note after glancing around to make sure no one saw check the footage from 10:58 a.m. She let them loose on purpose. The community was cracking, but not from pressure, from guilt. The final piece came from a place I didn't expect. The mailman. His name was Earl. Middle-aged, salt and pepper hair, been walking that route for 12 years. Said he saw the whole thing, saw the dogs run, saw Lucille fall, saw Darla stand and watch. I wanted to step in, he said, but when I got closer, she pulled them back, told me she had it handled. Said your mom just startled them. But those dogs didn't look startled. They looked trained. He gave me a statement, didn't want his name on it. But the words were there. So I gathered it all, stacked it like evidence. The emails, the footage, the testimony, the data from the HOA, the whispered truths, and with every new piece, my resolve hardened. Because it was no longer just about defending Lucille's dignity. It was about making sure no one else ever had to sit in silence, holding a teacup like a shield against the world. I returned home one evening, heart pounding, hands full of papers and proof. My mother was in the backyard, trimming what was left of her roses. I stood beside her, watched her for a moment. They tried to erase you, I said, but I think we got 'em. She didn't stop trimming, didn't smile, but I saw it in her shoulders. Just a touch of ease, a fraction of peace. This neighborhood, she said softly, ain't built for people like me to win. I shook my head. Then maybe it's time we change the blueprint. Because here in the neighborhood where apologies go to die, the truth was finally getting loud enough to make the walls shake. And that was just the beginning. There's something unforgiving about truth when it's caught on camera. It doesn't blink. It doesn't waver. It doesn't let you look away. The moment I held that USB in my hand, tucked inside an unmarked envelope with no return address, I knew what I was about to see would change everything. Not just how I viewed Darla Whitmore, but how I viewed this entire zip code. The footage came from the house across the street, Miriam Ellison's place, a tidy gray bungalow with white shutters and wind chimes that never stopped singing. Miriam was a widow in her 60s, kind to my mother in passing, always waving from her garden, but never lingering long enough for conversation. She had installed a security system last year after someone rummaged through her mailbox, and like most folks around here, she'd gone for the model with motion detection and high-definition clarity. I hadn't spoken to Miriam directly since the incident. It was her daughter, Lynette, who slipped the envelope into my mother's mailbox one afternoon. As casually as you'd pass along coupons, I caught her on the way back to her car. "Did you leave this?" I asked, holding up the envelope. She paused, lips pressed tight. "You didn't get it from me." I nodded slowly, understanding the fear even though it stung. "You sure you want me to open it?" "I want you to see it," she said, "but don't drag us into it. We just can't afford the fallout." She got into her car and pulled away before I could respond. I went inside, shut all the blinds, and opened my laptop, plugged in the drive. There were 2 files, both labeled only by timestamps. I clicked the first one. The screen blinked to life, and there it was, Monday morning. A bright, clear view of my mother's garden, The roses, the fence, and the slow, unbearable build of something ugly stepping into focus. Lucille was trimming the hedge, the sun on her back, moving slowly, carefully. Like always, Darla appeared seconds later, walking out onto her porch with both dogs already on leashes. She stopped, watching for a moment. Then she called out, not loud, not aggressive, but with just enough edge to make my mother pause. My mother looked up, gestured toward the bush, clearly explaining herself. Darla didn't move closer. She just crouched down, unclipped the leashes one by one, and stood back. The dogs didn't bolt immediately. They paced at first, tense, ears forward. Darla pointed, not yelled, pointed at my mother. Then she muttered something under her breath. It was hard to hear through the static. I turned up the volume, leaned in. She said, "Go get that old black witch off my lawn." Only she didn't say which. And then she smiled. It was that smile that made me freeze. The kind people give when they think pain is funny. The dogs sprang forward. My mother stumbled back, rake in hand, trying to wave them off without swinging. The dogs closed in fast, barking, snarling, snapping at her feet. Her dress, she fell. One of them lunged, just inches from her face, then backed off. Not because it wanted to, but because Darla finally called them back with a single word: enough. I sat there, hands clenched on the table, pulse thudding like a war drum. I played it again, slower, looked at every frame. Darla's expression never changed. The dogs weren't out of control. They were under command. My mother didn't provoke them. She was ambushed. And through it all, Darla behaved like she was watching television. Amused, detached. I clicked the second file. It was the aftermath. My mother slowly rising, rushing herself off, limping back toward her porch with the rake still clutched in her hand. Darla? She pulled her dogs inside, shut the door, and didn't look back once. Like none of it had happened. Like my mother's fear wasn't worth the weight of memory. I backed away from the laptop and paced the room. The air felt thick, heavy. This wasn't hearsay anymore. This wasn't opinion. It was evidence. And not just of an attack, but of intent, malice. The kind of deliberate cruelty that people wrap in neighborhood smiles and church attendance. And now that I had it, I couldn't pretend I didn't. But I also understood what Lynette meant. Having this footage put a target on my back. Not because I was lying, but because I was threatening to tell the truth. And in places like this, truth isn't welcome when it punches holes through the fabric of civility. I reached out to a friend from my college days. Someone who worked in digital security. I asked him to make 2 encrypted backups of the files. One for me, one for a third-party vault, just in case anything happened. Paranoia? Maybe, but I wasn't taking chances. The next day, I stopped by Lynette's again, just to thank her. She answered the door but didn't invite me in. "I don't want this going sideways," she said. "We've lived here too long. My mom's already getting weird looks for just talking to your mom at church." "I get it," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I'm not asking for a public statement. Just your blessing to use the footage." She hesitated. "We didn't do this for credit. We did it so someone else wouldn't get hurt. But please, if you post it, don't show the house. Don't mention us." I promised I wouldn't. And I meant it. I drove back to my place that afternoon, heart pacing a step behind my thoughts. What I had wasn't just video. It was a key, a door opener. But it also came with weight, because now the line between exposure and escalation was razor thin. The footage had the power to bring attention, maybe even accountability, but it could also bring retaliation. The Whitmores weren't just racist, they were protected. Darla had friends on the HOA board. Her husband had connections in legal circles, and this neighborhood, despite its manicured lawns and pastel-painted fences, was a machine designed to protect its image. And people like me were only welcome when we don't challenge the script. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the footage in my head, wondering if going public would really change anything. Would it bring justice, or just make life harder for my mother? For the few neighbors who still dared to nod our way in public. I thought about the Harrisons, the Delaney's, the others who had left without saying goodbye. How many of them had a Darla next door? How many had their own version of a rake and 2 unleashed dogs? In the morning, I took a drive, cleared my head, parked near the parkway, overlook, and sat with the engine off. I thought about my daughter, Mayura. Thought about what I'd tell her when she asked why Grandma wasn't laughing like she used to. I thought about the day she'd want to buy her first home, and how I'd have to explain what to look for, not just in the listing, but in the neighbors. And that's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to let fear write this story. I wasn't going to let silence be the closing note. I reached out to a journalist I trusted, someone who covered racial discrimination in housing and had a track record for handling stories with sensitivity and bite. I didn't give her everything, just the basics. Enough to let her know this wasn't speculation. It was fact. She was intrigued, cautious, but intrigued. We scheduled a meeting. Back at my mother's house, I found her out front, watering what remained of her rose bushes. The flowers weren't blooming, not yet, but the soil was soft and turned, ready. I told her what I planned to do. She didn't say much, just looked up at me, eyes sharp behind her tiredness. "Make sure you tell it right," she said. "Don't let them water it down." "I won't." And I meant it. Because that footage, it wasn't just video. It was history. A record. A reckoning. And I was done carrying it alone. I was ready to show the world what really lives behind some of these white fences. What they protect. What they breed. And more importantly, what happens when someone finally says, no. There's a kind of betrayal that doesn't come with knives or fists. It comes with paperwork, brushed suits, and forced smiles from people who call you sir right before they shut the door on your plea. When I walked into the state attorney's office with the flash drive in hand, I had hope. Not because I believed the system was built for us, but because I thought that maybe, just maybe, proof would force the system to do what it rarely does. Listen. The waiting room was sterile and too bright, with motivational posters peeling slightly at the corners, and a secretary who offered me a seat like it was a gift, not a right. I sat there holding the folder against my chest like it was a shield. When my name was called, I was ushered into a glass office with too little privacy and too many eyes. The assistant district attorney's name was Gerald Klein. Mid-40s, polished, polite, already carrying the look of someone who didn't want trouble. He gave me the practiced nod, the kind that says, "We'll humor you," without needing to say it out loud. I handed over the folder and watched him click through the footage, his brow furrowing, but not enough. Not enough to register the horror I'd felt watching it. Not enough to see my mother in the dirt, trying to protect herself with nothing but a garden tool and dignity. When the screen went black, he leaned back and said, "It's disturbing, no doubt. But I'm not seeing a clear criminal act here." I stared at him. "You're not seeing a criminal act? There's no physical contact. The dogs didn't bite. Your mother wasn't physically harmed. Ms. Whitmore didn't explicitly command them in a way we can prosecute. Her language is offensive, yes, but not unlawful. She weaponized her animals. She let them off leash on her own property. The dogs moved onto your mother's lawn. Yes, but that's a civil matter, not criminal. At most, it's a case for code enforcement, or a small claims dispute." I stood, pulse ringing in my ears. "So what? She has to draw blood for it to count." He didn't answer. Just gave me a card and said, "You're welcome to consult with a private attorney. But the state won't be pursuing charges at this time." I walked out without shaking his hand. And as I passed through the lobby, I understood the weight of what people mean when they say justice is blind. Not in the noble way, not in the balanced way, but in the way where it turns its head just enough to miss the truth it doesn't want to see. By the time I got to my car, I wasn't angry. I was activated. I drove straight to the house, pulled into the driveway, and walked inside. Lucille was in the living room, flipping through old photo albums, like she was searching for an anchor. I sat across from her, told her the DA passed. She didn't flinch, just closed the album, nodded once, and said, "Then you know what comes next." And I did. The next morning, I posted the footage. Not just the still. The full clip. Edited only for clarity, no commentary, no narration. I let the truth speak for itself. Captioned it simply, "This is what happened to my mother. The law won't protect her. Maybe the people will." It went viral in hours. Millions of views. Tens of thousands of shares. Hashtags exploding. Justice for Lucille trended by sunset. Celebrities reposted. Activists weighed in. News outlets emailed for interviews. For 48 hours, the internet roared louder than I'd ever heard it. But not all storms cleanse. Some just destroy. Within a day, Darla went public. Appearing on a local affiliate, tears barely clinging to the corners of her eyes, voice trembling as she claimed she was being targeted by a public figure bent on revenge. She insisted the dogs were startled by sudden movement, and that she'd always had a respectful relationship with her elderly neighbor. She called the footage misleading, and her husband promised to file defamation charges if I didn't take it down. Then came the death threats. Not to me, those I expected, but to Lucille. An anonymous letter in the mailbox, postmarked from Georgia, told her she should go back to where she came from. Another called her a fraud and accused her of trying to ruin a good woman's life. One email included nothing but a screenshot of a noose. Lucille didn't tell me about those at first. I found them tucked under her Bible, carefully folded and hidden between scriptures she used to read out loud when I was a kid. When I asked why she didn't tell me, she looked me in the eye and said, "Because I'm tired of being your reason to fight. You deserve more than war, son." But I wasn't fighting because she was weak. I was fighting because they mistook her silence for surrender. The days blurred. Media requests piled up. My team wanted to schedule appearances. People wanted Lucille on camera. She refused every single one. "I've said all I need to say," she told me. "Now it's their turn to listen." So I spoke instead. I went live, not as the basketball legend, not as the brand ambassador, but as a son. I told them how it felt to watch your mother tremble over garden shears, how a clean yard and soft eyes don't shield you from being dehumanized. I told them that in America sometimes it takes 20 million followers to be believed, and even then it's still a maybe. The flood of support was loud, beautiful, but fleeting, because that's how online outrage works. It spikes, it surges, and then it moves on. And Darla knew that. She just had to wait it out. The neighborhood grew colder. Mail stopped arriving on time. A delivery van accidentally crushed our mailbox. HOA citations returned, this time against Lucille for having inappropriate signage, though the lawn had no sign at all. Every morning felt like stepping onto a stage with spotlights aimed at our backs and whispers thick as fog. Even some of the folks who initially offered quiet support pulled away. "Just don't want to get caught in the crossfire," one neighbor texted. "I'm with you, but you have to understand this is our home too," said another. And I did understand. That's what made it worse. Lucille started spending more time in her bedroom, less time in the yard. The garden dried, the bushes browned, the flowers fell too soon. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a pot of cold tea. I pulled up a chair and asked if she regretted anything. She looked at me, then out the window. "I regret thinking this place would be different," she said. "But I don't regret standing still when those dogs came. If I had run, they'd have torn me apart." I stayed still, and she hated that I didn't flinch the way she wanted. That night, I understood something deeper. Lucille hadn't been silent because she was scared. She was silent because she knew the price of dignity, and she wasn't willing to sell hers just to make others comfortable. The footage stayed online. The legal threats came and went. Darla and Charles went quiet, fading from the airwaves after their narrative failed to hold. But they didn't leave. They stayed. They walked their dogs down different streets now. But their smirks hadn't changed. There was no arrest, no trial, no press conference declaring victory. But something had shifted. A new family moved in down the street. Black couple, 3 kids. When I stopped by to introduce myself, the father looked me in the eye and said, "We saw the video. That's why we chose this neighborhood." Lucille watched them play from her porch a week later. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. And me. I still walk past the Whitmore house. Still feel the weight of what could have happened. What almost did. This wasn't justice. It wasn't closure. But it was a reckoning. And sometimes, that's the first crack in a wall that's been standing too long. That night, I walked her out to her car and stood there until she drove away. The lights from the Whitmore house flicked on, off, then back on again. Deliberate. Measured. Like they were counting. The next morning, I found 2 of my tires slashed, not knifed in some messy rage, but carefully punctured. Like someone knew exactly how to make the damage look like a pothole incident, unless you looked close. No note, no spray paint, just that low, simmering message: "You're not welcome here anymore." I didn't call the police. Not because I didn't want justice, but because I already knew what the report would say. No witnesses, no cameras, no suspects. Same song, different verse. Besides, we both knew they'd take Darla's call faster than they'd take mine. Then came the mail. It stopped arriving regularly. For a week straight, nothing. Not a bill, not a magazine, not even a flyer. Then, all at once, a stack dumped in the box like someone had kept it. then dropped it off out of guilt. I called the post office. They promised to look into it. Never did. Lucille tried to keep things normal. She planted a new set of lilies near the front porch and told me, life needs color, no matter how gray it feels. But even her hands shook sometimes when she bent down to trim a stem. She pretended not to notice the way neighbors crossed the street, instead of walking past our home, or how the HOA suddenly lost her garden approval forms. At first I thought maybe we'd won. Maybe exposing Darla meant she'd be forced out, pressured to pack up and disappear like the others who'd left under quieter circumstances. But Darla wasn't the type to back down. She wasn't afraid of the spotlight. She'd worn it like armor, painted herself as the victim, the misunderstood woman under attack by celebrity outrage. And once the news cycle shifted to the next scandal, she slipped right back into the rhythm of the town's denial. What hurt wasn't her smirk. It was the silence of those who once nodded at us from across the street. People who brought over casseroles after Lucille's surgery last year now pretended not to see her. One woman who once asked for parenting advice from Mayra now rushed her kids inside when we walked by. We weren't pariahs because we lied. We were pariahs because we told the truth. It made me question things, not whether what we did was right. I knew it was. But whether right was enough. Whether justice was reserved only for those who could make enough noise, or for those who dared to whisper in the wrong place. I thought about the countless stories that never made it to cameras. About the women like Lucille who stayed silent not out of fear but out of exhaustion. Because here's what cancel culture doesn't fix. It doesn't change the soil these towns are planted in. It doesn't reach into the churches that preach unity but enforce division through whispered exclusions. It doesn't break the HOA rules written to look neutral, but enforced with precision against the same people over and over. It doesn't erase the email chains or the subtle backdoor alliances. And it sure as hell doesn't make Darla pack her bags. Instead, it makes the town lean in harder. Lucille's weekly book club stopped meeting at the church, moved to someone else's house. No explanation, just a text saying change of plans. When she asked why, the reply was vague. It's better for the group. Better. Meaning quieter. Easier. Less controversial. Mayra stopped going to the community gym after the third time someone accidentally booked the entire facility during her session. Once, someone left a ragged piece of raw meat on her windshield, wrapped in a plastic bag with a note that said, "Go back to the jungle." No fingerprints, no cameras, just silence again. And through it all, I felt a question creeping in, heavier with each passing day. Was this worth it? I didn't say it out loud, not even to Lucille, but she felt it. One night, as we sat on the back porch, listening to the quiet hum of the crickets and the occasional distant bark from Darla's yard, she turned to me and said, "You think maybe we should have let it lie?" I didn't answer at first, because I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to hurt her. After a long pause, I said, "I think maybe they were always going to come for us, whether we spoke or stayed silent, but at least now we're not pretending we belong to something that never wanted us in the first place." She nodded slowly. That's what I thought too. We sat there until the moon shifted overhead, and in the stillness I realized something that helped me breathe a little easier. Resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to move. We didn't move. We didn't hide. Darla walked her dogs past our house, looking straight ahead, but she never looked at us. Not once. That was something. Small, but something. Mayra started sketching again. She drew a mural on the back fence, fists raised, flowers blooming out of knuckles. She called it Still Growing. Lucille started baking again. Pound cake. Banana bread. Left a plate on the porch every Saturday with a little handwritten note. No bitterness, just butter. I didn't post much anymore. Didn't need to. The internet had moved on. But we hadn't. And maybe that was the quietest form of rebellion in places like this. Refusing to disappear. Refusing to crumble. Refusing to carry shame that didn't belong to us. Because cancel culture, that's just a but justice? Real justice? That takes staying power. And we were still here. The strange thing about truth is that sometimes it doesn't march in loud and proud. It slips through the cracks, whispered from tired mouths to tired ears, hoping someone will finally listen. That's how Errol Granger found me. Not with a press release or a bold declaration, but with a soft knock on Lucille's back door and a voice that sounded like worn leather, weathered, but not broken. It was a Sunday morning. Sunlight still yawning across the backyard. I was on the porch, nursing coffee, and watching Monera repaint the fence she'd turned into a mural. A knock came from the side gate. 3 taps. Soft, deliberate. I stepped down to find an older man, in a navy windbreaker and khaki pants, his hands folded behind his back like he was ready for church, or a confession. "You Shaquille?" he asked. I nodded. "That's me." He didn't smile, just glanced over his shoulder before stepping closer. "Name's Errol Granger. I worked maintenance for the HOA here for 17 years. Retired last May. Your mom, she's a good woman. I saw what happened. Been watching since." He reached into his coat and pulled out a manila envelope. Fat, dog-eared, sealed with tape. Handed it to me without ceremony. "You need to read what's in here. Carefully. Quietly. Lot of people worked hard to make sure this stuff never saw daylight." I didn't open it right away. Just looked him in the eye and asked, "Why me? Why now?" He took a deep breath. "Because you're not scared. And because they are. That whole board. That whole setup, they're not just looking out for one of their own. They've been doing this for years. You just happened to shine a light when the mask slipped." He didn't stay long. Just turned and walked back toward the street, like he delivered a message, and that was enough. I watched him go, then took the envelope inside and laid it flat on the kitchen table like it might burn through the wood. Lucille sat beside me, her tea untouched. Mara hovered at the doorway. We opened it together. Inside were photocopies, pages and pages of documentation, internal emails from board members, fines issued disproportionately to Black and Latino homeowners, handwritten notes from board meetings, copies of eviction threats, maintenance complaints doctored to look worse than they were. It all painted a clear picture. This wasn't negligence. It was orchestration. Errol had kept it all. Every memo, every note, every offhanded comment scribbled in the margins of agendas. And woven through it, like a bad signature, was one name, again and again: Darla Whitmore. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the architect of this sickness, a woman who had used bureaucracy like a scalpel, carving out anyone who didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. One email from a 2018 meeting chilled me. It was from Darla to the HOA president. "We need to be more assertive in preserving the community's values. Certain households aren't reflecting the image we promised our buyers. Let's tighten the regulations before it's too late." The certain households she referenced: 3 families, all Black. 2 had since moved. The third, a couple that had filed a complaint against her, and were suddenly hit with 5 citations in 3 weeks for minor code violations. This wasn't racism dressed in rage. It was racism dressed in policy. I spent the next few days cross-referencing the documents with what I already had: footage, neighbor statements, old emails from the Harrisons and Tucker Delaney. It all lined up. Errol's file wasn't just a smoking gun, it was a blueprint. The system had been rigged from the inside, and Darla had help: board members, neighbors, even a property management company that lost paperwork from Black residents more often than not. But I couldn't go to court. The DA had already shown where they stood. And besides, this wasn't just a legal battle. It was cultural, structural, personal. So I did what I'd learned to do in this fight. I started talking. Not to lawyers, to people. I went door to door, not like a salesman, but like a neighbor. I spoke to anyone who would listen. I shared parts of Errol's documents with those who'd been targeted, explained the patterns. I didn't ask for action. I asked for stories, and they came. Quietly at first: a mother who'd been fined for her son's bicycle being left in the yard, but her white neighbor's trampoline had been in theirs for 2 years without notice. A man who'd received a letter suggesting his porch chairs were non-conforming, even though he bought them at the same place as everyone else. An elderly couple who'd applied to install a ramp for medical access and were delayed for 6 months pending board review. Each voice was a crack in the wall. And then the whispers turned to noise. We held a meeting, unofficial, off the books, at a local rec center 2 towns over, away from the board's eyes. I sent out flyers under the name Community for Fair Living. No big logos, no cameras, just chairs, a coffee urn, and a safe space to talk. 27 people showed up. Then 35 the next week. By the 3rd meeting, we had nearly 60. Different colors, different stories, but the same thread: they'd been targeted, ignored, or silenced. Many hadn't even realized they weren't alone until now. And standing in that room, listening to voice after voice rise with anger, grief, disbelief, I realized this wasn't just a case, it was a movement. We started documenting. Everyone who spoke signed a consent form. gave us their story, their dates, their proof. We compiled a dossier so thick it needed a binder the size of a law textbook. Errol came back too, stood at the front of the room one night, and told everyone how he used to mop the floors in the HOA office and overhear conversations that made his skin crawl. How he saw Darla once scribble "too ghetto" next to a name on a tenant application. "You want to fix it?" he asked the crowd. "You burn the whole thing down, start over. But not with fire, with facts and voices." We started calling ourselves the Network. A small local resistance built not on outrage, but on quiet, unshakable truth. And word began to spread. One of the new families in the neighborhood, black, fresh-faced, full of hope, showed up at the next meeting with questions. They'd been given a warning for having a welcome mat that didn't align with community standards. The mat read, "You are seen." They asked what they could do. I said, "Stay loud." And stay. Mara joined us too. She began interviewing attendees, recording audio clips, and stitching together a podcast called Fenced In. We uploaded the first episode anonymously. It got over 50,000 streams in a week. Stories started pouring in from across the state. People wanted to talk, to be heard, to be seen. One night, back on the porch, Lucille handed me a letter. It was from a woman in Michigan. She'd heard the podcast and wrote to say, "I thought I was crazy for years, but now I know I was just quiet too long." Lucille folded the letter back into its envelope. "You turned whispers into something." "No," I told her. "They were always speaking. I just finally started listening." By the end of the month, we had a plan. We weren't just going to expose Darla. We were going to replace the entire board. Not with outsiders. With residents. With people who had skin in the game, and souls rooted in community. Not exclusion. We drafted a candidate list. We ran campaigns. Knocked on doors. Not for donations, but for trust. And as the HOA election loomed, something shifted in the air. You could feel it. The tightness in the smiles. The nervousness in Darla's walk. The porch lights staying on longer. The for sale signs popping up not from fear, but from reckoning. Because now, the neighborhood knew. The system hadn't just failed. It had been complicit, but not anymore. Because the whispers had finally found their voice. She looked at the microphone like it was an old friend who finally asked the right question. But peace is funny in America. It ain't the absence of noise. It's the presence of control. And when we moved into this neighborhood, me and later my son, I thought we'd finally made it. The lawns were clean, the streets quiet, the neighbors friendly, but the rot don't always show on the outside. Sometimes it hides behind smiling faces and garden parties. She took a breath, longer this time. When that woman Darla sicked those dogs on me, it wasn't the first time I'd seen hatred up close. But it was the first time I felt it smiling at me. Like it wasn't rage. It was sport. Her hands twitched slightly, then steady. I didn't run. Not 'cause I'm brave, but 'cause I knew running made me pray. And even when they pulled the dogs back, and I stood there shaking, it wasn't the barking I heard the loudest. It was her laughter, soft, satisfied, the kind that tells you she's done this before. Maybe not with dogs, maybe not with teeth, but with laws, with letters, with power. There was a silence in the room after that. Mara's hand hovered over the volume board, eyes wet, but focused. Lucille leaned in slightly, her voice now smooth as a sermon. And let me say this clear for anyone listening. This ain't just about one woman with two big dogs. This is about the system that let her think she could do that, and still sleep good at night. The system that sent me 3 fines for having a wind chime that was too reflective but didn't send her one for nearly mauling a 74-year-old woman. The same system that raised eyebrows at my grandbaby for being tall and proud, but didn't flinch when a neighbor followed her down 3 grocery aisles. She straightened, the fire in her rising. This neighborhood calls itself diverse. But that just means they let us in, not that they ever wanted us here. They smile when we don't ask questions. They wave when we stay quiet. But the minute we speak, really speak, they act like we broke something holy. Lucille's story didn't just unravel the lie. It burned it. She talked about raising me through the 80s, navigating schools that claimed equality, while separating kids by zip code and skin tone. She talked about how she was treated differently at every bank she walked into. How she started making me dress in suits by age 10, just to make us less threatening. And she talked about how the pain of racism isn't always loud. It's slow. It's death by 1,000 dignified cuts. When she finished, she folded her hands again, stared at the floor for a long second, then said softly, They thought they could shame me into silence. But what they forgot is that I was born into silence. And I learned how to speak anyway. The podcast dropped that night. No announcement. No press push. Just a quiet upload with the title Lucille, a name you tried to bury. By morning it had crossed 1 million plays. Not just because of the story, but because of how she told it. Calm, direct, no frills, no begging for sympathy. Just facts laid bare, like bones on a table. The responses came like rainfall. Letters, DMs, emails from women in Ohio, Mississippi, Colorado, saying they'd heard their own mothers in her voice, saying they were crying in traffic, saying they'd played it for their teenage daughters, so they'd understand that the fight wasn't over, just quieter now. A segment aired on national news 2 days later. An anchor with perfect hair said Lucille's voice reminded her of what we owe the generations who came before. Politicians tweeted support. Local officials issued statements. The mayor, previously silent, asked to meet with us. We declined. Because this wasn't about photo ops. It was about accountability. And Lucille? She didn't change. She didn't bask. She didn't gloat. She still baked on Saturdays, still wrote thank you notes to every person who dropped off flowers or a card, still moved through the house like she wasn't a symbol, just a woman trying to breathe in peace. But something had changed in the neighborhood. 3 homes that hadn't spoken to us in months suddenly started waving again. One woman brought over a pie with an apology card taped to the lid. The new family from down the block came to sit with Lucille on the porch every Sunday evening, just to hear her talk. Not because she was famous now, but because they wanted to understand what they'd walked into, and what she had endured to stand in it. Darla didn't say a word. Her husband filed a cease and desist letter, trying to block the podcast's spread, but the truth had already rooted itself. And unlike their HOA citations, this couldn't be stamped out or shredded. The podcast episodes kept coming, featuring other voices, Tucker Delaney, the Harrisons, even Errol. But Lucille's story, it was the cornerstone, the match that lit the whole barn. Late one night, I asked her if she felt any different, if she felt free. She looked at me, the porch light catching the lines on her face like a map of every mile she'd walked. I don't know about free, she said, but I ain't quiet anymore. And that's a start. And in that moment, I knew what Darla tried to do wasn't just about humiliation. It was about erasure, about making a woman like Lucille feel small, unseen, forgettable. But now her name was in mouths, across the country. Not as a victim, but as a voice. And you can't silence a voice that finally learned how to speak. You can only hold your breath for so long, before the truth rises to the surface like a held-in scream. That's what it felt like, in our town the week after Lucille's voice went viral. It didn't explode all at once. It swelled, like rising water. One person spoke, then another. Eyes met that used to avoid, doors opened that used to stay shut. And suddenly, what had been a lonely fight in the shadows became something else. A reckoning, born not from rage, but from truth finally walking in with its head held high. It started with the letters. Dozens of them. Handwritten notes, printed emails, envelopes with shaky cursive and smeared stamps. From Atlanta, Chicago, Oregon, Philly. Some came from folks who'd never stepped foot in Florida. Black mothers who said Lucille reminded them of their own. White men who admitted they'd stayed silent too long. Teachers, retirees, activists. One man from Ohio said he'd never cried before listening to a podcast episode, until he heard Lucille say, "Peace in America ain't the absence of noise. It's the presence of control." He ended his letter with, "Tell your mama we heard her." I didn't respond to every message. I couldn't. But I read them all, and each one chipped away at the quiet that had ruled our neighborhood for too long. So I did something I hadn't done since my playing days. I organized an event, a public one, not a rally, not a protest, a town hall. But this wasn't for politicians or press. This was for the people who'd been fined into silence, who'd been watched like intruders in the place they paid taxes to live, who'd been told in 1,000 soft ways that they didn't belong. We booked the high school gym 2 miles from the subdivision. Neutral ground. Chairs in rows. Mic on a stand. Flyers went out with one phrase printed in bold, across the top. Your story matters. I expected 20, maybe 30 people. We got over 100. Folks came with folders, with memories, with pain packed tight behind their eyes. Some were angry, sure, but most were just tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of swallowing the sting. They took their seats, looked around, and realized for the first time they weren't alone. I opened the event with a simple promise. No shouting, no arguing, no cameras, just truth. However you carry it, speak it. And speak they did. The first was Mr. David Kimbrough. Widower. Lived here 15 years. Stepped to the mic with a trembling hand and a folder full of paperwork. He told us about being fined 6 times in 1 year for unregistered garden equipment, which turned out to be his late wife's bird bath, and a wooden bench they'd built together. He said he'd asked for an appeal, was denied, and told by a board member to consider downsizing to something more suitable for your demographic. Next came Marcia Alvarez. Her voice cracked as she told us how her son was accused of theft after a neighbor's bike went missing. No evidence, just suspicion. He was 13. The bike was found 2 days later in the neighbor's own garage. No apology, no correction, just silence. Then came a couple who'd lived on the edge of the subdivision. Jules and Meredith. They spoke together, passing the mic back and forth like the story hurt too much to carry alone. They talked about being denied a ramp for Jules' father, who used a wheelchair. The HOA delayed approvals until his health declined, and he moved into a facility. He died thinking it was his fault. Jules said, voice shaking, that he was asking for too much. Each story peeled another layer off the town's pristine image, and for every person who stood at that mic, 5 more sat in the crowd nodding along, holding their own histories in clenched hands. But what surprised me most was what happened halfway through. An apology. It came from a woman I'd seen before, never spoken to. Lisa Remington. White. Late 40s. Always out jogging in the mornings with her headphones in. She stepped to the mic, took a long breath, and said, I want to say I'm sorry to the Harrisons. I was on the board when those letters went out. I didn't write them, but I didn't stop them either. I told myself it wasn't my place, but it was, and I failed. She didn't make excuses. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just owned it. And that cracked something open. More followed. A man admitted he once called the HOA to complain about Lucille's lawn, because everyone else was. A teenager said he used to make jokes about Madara's height, until he realized he'd never made those jokes about white girls who played basketball. One by one, shame turned into responsibility. And then came the moment that changed everything. A woman stood near the back. Tall, red curls, sharp blazer. She raised her hand, and people murmured when they saw her face. Darla hadn't shown, but her sister had. Her name was Colleen, lived 3 neighborhoods over. She said she hadn't spoken to Darla in months, not since the footage surfaced. She's not here to face you, Colleen said. But I came to tell you this. She's leaving. House is going on the market this week. They've packed up already. The room went still. No cheers, no clapping. Just the sound of weight being lifted. Colleen didn't stay long, just offered a soft nod to Lucille before leaving the way she came. Quiet, almost invisible. Later that night, back at the house, we sat on the porch. Me, Lucille, and Mara, with the moon casting shadows through the jasmine vines. Lucille had planted 2 summers ago. The house next door was dark, windows bare, curtains gone. A moving van had pulled up earlier in the evening. Quiet crew, no waves. Lucille watched it all like she was watching a memory end. Do you feel different? I asked. She didn't answer right away, just sipped her tea and leaned. I feel seen, she finally said. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to explain why I'm here. Miara reached over and took her hand. No words, just connection. And me? I looked out across the yard, at the homes that had once looked down on us like we were temporary, and I felt something I hadn't felt since all this began. Not victory, but validation. We didn't win in a courtroom. We didn't burn anything down. We didn't scream louder than they could ignore. We just stayed. We told the truth, and when people heard it, really heard it, they showed up, with open hands, with open hearts. Because empathy isn't weakness. It's strength with direction. And truth. Truth is a storm that takes its time. Before I went back inside, I turned to Lucille and said, now they know, we're not invisible. She smiled, not with her mouth, but with her whole body. And that was enough. We had a barbecue last week. Not one of those HOA-mandated block parties with name tags and plastic forks. A real one. Smoke in the air. Music loud enough to make your bones dance. Kids running through sprinklers. Someone brought sweet tea that could knock you sideways. Someone else brought homemade empanadas that disappeared in minutes. No one whispered. No one stared. People came up to Lucille to thank her, some with tears in their eyes. Others just stood beside her in quiet respect. She didn't take credit. She never does. But I saw how she stood in that crowd, not shrinking, not scanning for threats. Just being. That's its own kind of justice. Mara's mural on the back fence has grown too. She added a second panel. This one filled with faces. Not famous ones. Just neighbors. Locals. All kinds of shades and shapes. Above it she painted the words, "We belong here." Simple. Unapologetic. She got accepted into her top choice college last week. When I asked how she was feeling, she said, "I'm taking Grandma's voice with me." That's the thing about truth. It echoes long after the noise fades. As for me, I still get asked how I stayed calm, how I didn't let rage consume me. But what people don't understand is that rage didn't belong to me. It belonged to a system that was breaking. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just had to tell the truth loud enough that no one could pretend they didn't hear it. Sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens or press conferences. Sometimes it doesn't roar. Sometimes it's just a woman planting new flowers in the same soil that tried to bury her. Sometimes it's a daughter painting hope where pain once sat. Sometimes it's a barbecue with too much laughter and not enough forks. Sometimes it's knowing your mailbox won't be tampered with this week, or that your daughter can walk the aisles of a grocery store and be treated like any other kid. That's justice too. And that's what this neighborhood has started to become. Not perfect, not fixed, but honest. And that's more than I ever thought we'd get. I walked past the Whitmore house today. Well, it's not theirs anymore. The couple inside put wind chimes on the porch. Real ones. Not the kind Lucille was fined for, but ones that sing in the breeze and remind you that life is still moving. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, just long enough to hear the chimes. They sounded like freedom. When I got back to our house, Lucille was in the kitchen humming, mixing cornbread batter with one hand, sipping lemonade with the other. I leaned in the doorway and watched her for a minute. "You ever think it'd look like this?" I asked. She didn't pause, didn't let myself dreaming was dangerous. Now, I just try to enjoy it. Miara came down the hall with a paintbrush tucked behind her ear, looking like she'd wrestled a rainbow and won. "We're gonna need more fence," she said. "People keep asking if they can be added." "Add them," Lucille said. "Every face, every one that stood up or sat beside us. Fill it up." And just like that, the past felt smaller, still real, still part of the soil, but no longer the thing trying to haunt us. I don't know what'll happen 10 years from now. Maybe the board flips again. Maybe someone like Darla buys back in. Maybe racism never really leaves. It just shifts, changes clothes. But now we know what to do. Now we know how to shine a light without burning ourselves out. Now we've built something that whispers louder than hate can shout. The house still stands, but so do we. And this time, we're not going anywhere. If this story stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Share it at your dinner table. Bring it up in rooms where silence usually wins. And look a little closer at the places you call safe. Justice isn't a moment, it's a mindset. And the next chapter, it's waiting for you to write it.